Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast, where we feature questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of YFP Planning's fee-only certified financial planners. Before we jump into today's question, I want to give a shout out to YFP Planning's incredible team that makes this segment possible. YFP Planning offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning services that are customized to the pharmacy professional. You can learn more and book a free discovery call by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. Okay, this week's question comes from Marissa in Bluffton, South Carolina.
Hi, I'm Marissa from Bluffton, South Carolina. Our home has increased in value by over $100,000 since last year when we refinanced. We don't have any PMI. Is there any benefit to getting another appraisal to prove the equity that we've gained? Would it be wise to use the equity to pay off high interest debt like credit cards?
Thank you, Marissa, for submitting your question to be featured on this week's Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast. Tim Baker, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think just like most questions that are asked on the segment, I'd probably be asking questions before giving an answer. So I think for me, Marissa, the first thing that I would ask is like, how much credit card are we talking? Credit card debt are we talking here? Is this something that we can pay off in a relatively short period of time? Just by maneuvering cash reserves, investments, or even kind of looking at cash flow and budgeting. Because I would say like, when we talk about the baby steps of the financial plan, Tim, the consumer debt, the credit card debt is going to be one of the main first things that we look at. Mm-hmm. So, and again, I think part of this is is there a systemic reason why that credit card debt is there? Or is this kind of a one-off where, we had a bunch of travel or something that, really kind of allowed that credit card debt to accrue? Beyond that, once we kind of figure out those answers and we, feel good about potentially looking at debt options to solve the issue versus something like cash or investments, in most cases, we're probably going to want to forego something like a second mortgage. Typically, you go and do a second mortgage if you want to make a major improvement to your house, like an addition or, redo the kitchen or something like that. You probably don't want to do a cash out refi just because you've already refinanced and the rates are higher than they were in the past. If we make that assumption. So probably the best approach, Tim, would be considering something like a HELOC, a home equity line of credit. So this is a revolving source of funds, much like a credit card that you can access, but it's actually collateralized by your house, which means that the house is the underlying asset, which makes the bank feel more comfortable to give you the money, because if you don't pay it back, they can potentially put a lien on the house or even take the house. So something like an uncollateralized debt would be something like a student loan debt or credit card debt. So typically the HELOC is less risk, which means the rates are lower, but not necessarily as low as what you would get from when you refinance the property. So one of the things that you would have to look at is that does it make sense for there to be an appraisal, which is what the question is. Do we need to have an appraisal to figure out what we have gained? So in some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Probably in this market, yes. That would be probably the best thing to do that will allow you to determine like the value of the asset, the house. But like I said, sometimes a full appraisal is not required. So it's going to be dependent on who you actually work with. Now, a typical HELOC will allow you to access 80%. Sometimes they go up as high as 90% of the equity. So what does that mean? That means, Tim, if my house is worth $500,000, $500,000, and my mortgage is $400,000, that means I have $100,000 of equity in the house. Now, in most cases, I'll be allowed to access 80% of that $100,000 or $80,000. That's what I can basically take out and then use to pay down the high interest credit card debt. The important thing to remember is that the rate that is typically used is variable. So again, it's going to be more than what your mortgage interest rate, which a lot of people, it's a fixed rate, but it's also going to be variable, which we've seen over the last months, even how that's ticked up over time. So there could be a little bit of variability and increased cost there. Now, you're probably seeing increases across the board with all types of that, even things like credit cards. So, the one advantage of the HELOC is that you kind of pay on what you actually take out. So I don't have to take out the full $80,000, which that's one of the disadvantages of the second mortgage. You kind of say like, hey, I have a $50,000 project. I need $50,000 and that's all I get. Whereas in a HELOC, you could take out $80,000 and leave that $30,000 to the side, like not take it, but then you could take, another 10 all the way up to that $80,000. So you basically are paying much like a credit card. You're paying on the debt that you've actually taken. Now there are going to be things like annual fees and inactivity charges. There are going to be closing fees. Like when you actually do it, it should be a lot less than a typical mortgage. Some providers waive closing costs, but that probably means they're just going to be charging you more interest because we know, no free lunch. So there's lots of things that go into this. I would say, given, Marissa, your scenario, the first thing I would say, is this even necessary? Are there things that we can do in the short term, even something as simple as, a zero interest credit card deal?
That's where my mind is going, Tim. Yeah, not ideal, but
Right. It's not necessarily, to me, it's a Band-Aid, but does it allow you to give you some breathing room even before you go down the path of paying down cash reserves, taking money out of the market because we know investments are depressed right now, but even going down these, options of debt. So I think the big thing is like, what's the credit card debt look like? What's your burn rate? Are there ways for us to kind of work through this before we kind of even get into the HELOC discussion?
Tim, I love the way you approach this question because I think it's another great example of the creativity that can come. We're just talking about a tiny slice, right, of the financial plan, although an important one, obviously, as it relates to this question. But, the creativity that can come from a lot of options that are out there. But first, before we even get to those options, like what's going on? You mentioned the burn rate. Is this a one-time thing? It's done. Is this, we're anticipating other debt in the future? And I thought you highlighted so well the HELOC and think about all the costs, right? You're transferring one rate for another rate, ideally a lower rate. But you mentioned, closing costs, could be application fees, could be inactivity fees, so there's certainly some advantages there, but also costs that need to be considered along the way as well. But lots of different ways to approach it. But I love the approaching this in terms of like, what's going on? Like, let's kind of figure out what's behind the scenes. What's the story? What's the amount? Are there other options we're not thinking about? And then we can, plug a solution accordingly. So
yeah,
great stuff. And Marissa, really appreciate the question. Not sure that we've answered a question like this specifically with the angle. And I think for many where they're seeing appreciation in their homes, certainly over the last couple of years, I'm guessing folks are looking at that equity growing and wondering, what opportunities might be there. So Marissa, thanks for taking time to submit the question. As a small thank you, we're going to be sending you a super comfy YFP t-shirt, and we would love to take questions from others that are listening to the show. If you have a question you'd like us to answer, two ways that you can submit your question. One, you can email us info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com, or you can record your question directly by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask-YFP. As we wrap up this week's Ask a YFP CFP episode, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. For more information on this, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.